have lived in this house long enough to know when something is wrong, not because of noise or shouting but because the walls feel tight as if the air itself is holding its breath. I am Eleanor Hayes, and for 38 years this house in a quiet North Carolina town has been the center of my life. I raised my children here, buried my parents from here, and watched my husband slowly disappear into illness from the same bedroom window. Every morning I wake before dawn, make coffee, and sit at the small kitchen table facing the backyard where an old oak tree stands like a witness to everything that ever happened here. My son Marcus used to climb that tree when he was little, scraping his knees and laughing while I yelled for him to be careful. Those laughs feel like echoes now because the man who lives upstairs no longer sounds like the boy I raised. Marcus moved back home 3 years ago after what he called a temporary financial setback. He came with his wife Lauren and 2 suitcases full of expensive clothes and quiet resentment. At first I told myself it was just stress that made him short with me or made Lauren look through me like I was part of the furniture. I gave them the master bedroom because it had its own bathroom, and my husband Henry could no longer manage stairs, so we took the small room near the kitchen. I told myself families adjust, that love bends and stretches, but it does not break. I was wrong. The change did not come all at once. It came in small, sharp moments, like Lauren reorganizing my kitchen without asking, or Marcus reminding me that times had changed. When I cooked the same meals I always had, they spoke to me as if I were fragile, as if my opinions were antiques like the china my mother left me. One afternoon I returned from the pharmacy to find a stranger sitting in my living room, a man in a suit with a leather folder. Marcus explained calmly that it was just a consultation, nothing to worry about. Later that night I heard them whispering upstairs. Words like assets, planning, control, guardianship floated down the hallway and settled in my chest like stones. Henry noticed too. Even as his body failed, his mind remained clear, sharp enough to see the way our own son avoided our eyes. Days later Marcus suggested we sign some papers just to make things easier. He said, his voice rehearsed smooth. I asked what the papers were, and he sighed the way he used to when I made him clean his room. Mom, he said, this is for your own good. What if something happens to you? Or Dad, we need to be prepared. I said, no, not yet. And that was when the house truly changed. The air turned heavy. Conversations stopped. When I entered rooms, Lauren began calling me by my first name instead of Mom, and Marcus stopped sitting with his father in the evenings. A week later I found the door to the den locked, the room Henry had used for decades to read and write notes in his careful handwriting. Marcus said they needed the space for work that night. Henry squeezed my hand and whispered that something was wrong. His voice trembled, not with fear but with anger I had not heard in years. The breaking point came on a humid afternoon when the power went out and the house fell into silence. Marcus came home early, his jaw set. Lauren followed, carrying a folder thick with documents. They told us we needed to talk. They stood while Henry and I sat as if we were children being corrected. Marcus said he had spoken to a lawyer and that due to our age and Henry health issues it would be best if he assumed responsibility for the house and finances. Lauren nodded, adding that it was temporary and for our safety. I laughed at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding, but Marcus did not smile. He told us that refusing would only make things complicated, that courts do not look kindly on elderly people who refuse help. That was when Henry stood up slowly, using the table for support, and told our son that he had no right to take what was not offered. Marcus' face hardened. He said, enough. He said we were being difficult. He said this house would be his anyway. And then he said something that cut deeper than any threat. He said we were holding him back. I remember the sound of the door when they pushed us into the basement that night, the way the light disappeared and the smell of earth wrapped around us. Marcus' voice echoed through the door, telling us to think about our choices, telling us he was disappointed in us. I sat on the cold steps holding Henry, feeling the years collapse around me. Everything I had given, everything I had forgiven led to this moment of darkness. But in that darkness Henry leaned close and whispered words I did not expect. He told me to listen to the wall. He told me that some truths survive only because they are hidden, and that Marcus had no idea what this house still held. I did not understand then, but I felt something shift inside me. The fear drained away, leaving behind a cold, steady resolve, because I realized in that moment that my son had mistaken silence for weakness and age for surrender, and he was about to learn how wrong he was. When the door finally opened the next morning, Marcus acted as if nothing had happened. He spoke softly, asked if we were calm now, as if locking your parents in a basement were a reasonable disagreement. Henry was barely standing, and I focused on getting him back to bed because I understood something important that night. Panic would only feed them, silence would starve them. In the days that followed I became invisible on purpose. I cooked, cleaned, nodded, agreed. Lauren relaxed. Marcus grew confident. They stopped hiding conversations, and that is when I began listening. I heard about a power of attorney already prepared, about a buyer interested in the land, about how the house was worth more than expected. Henry's health declined, but his eyes burned with urgency. One evening when Marcus and Lauren were out, he asked me to bring his old toolbox from the garage. I thought it strange, until he showed me the false bottom where he had Hidden documents since before Marcus was born, papers his own father had told him never to destroy, land deeds, mineral rights, trust agreements, names that were not supposed to surface but still carried legal weight. Henry explained in a low voice that the land our house sat on was never fully transferred, that a trust existed protecting it from exactly this kind of takeover, that Marcus had no claim no matter what papers he forged or forced signed. I felt something inside me awaken, not anger, not grief, but clarity. All my life I had deferred, softened, waited. Now I saw the shape of the end, and I understood that I did not need to raise my voice. I needed to let the truth walk into the light on its own. So I made a call to a woman whose number I had saved years ago out of idle curiosity, a lawyer known for dismantling family betrayals quietly, efficiently. I gave her the facts, nothing more. She told me to wait. And so I did. Marcus and Lauren grew impatient. They brought strangers through the house, measuring walls, discussing renovations, speaking as if Henry and I were already gone, but every step they took pulled the trap tighter. They did not know the trust required a public reading. They did not know the signatures they needed were impossible. They did not know that greed always makes people careless, and when the day came when they finally tried to move us out officially, they would discover that they had built their future on ground that could not be taken, and that the house they believed they owned was about to remind them who it truly belonged to. The morning sun poured golden light across the living room, painting the walls with warmth that felt almost unreal. I sat quietly in my favorite armchair, the steam of my tea curling lazily toward the ceiling. Outside, the garden was alive with autumn, leaves dancing in the breeze, the pecan tree standing like a silent witness to decades of memory. Everything looked ordinary, but I knew better. The air carried the weight of decisions that had reshaped not only my life, but the fragile world of my son, Trevant. I could feel the remnants of that storm, a subtle tension that lingered like a shadow. 6 months had passed since the confrontation, yet the echoes of those days were never far. Trevant and Kessia had vanished, leaving behind the hollow shell of their once grandiose ambitions. Letters from distant relatives spoke of their quiet provincial life, a world stripped of the prestige and power they had clung to so desperately. I did not rejoice in their downfall. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that truth, meticulously preserved and revealed, had restored the balance. Cornelius' absence was the only real emptiness. I wandered through the house, touching the objects he had loved, remembering the life we had shared, the sacrifices we had made together. His presence lingered, not in the chaos of family power struggles, but in the small, tender moments. A hand on mine during a storm, a shared laugh over a broken faucet, the warmth of a glance that spoke of decades of devotion. Those memories were mine to keep, untarnished by the illusions of greed or false legacy. Down in the basement, my sanctuary now gleaming with new shelves and bright light, I set about cataloging my own story. I opened a fresh album, placing Langston Dubois' letter on the first page, a cornerstone of truth and love. Beside it, I placed an old photograph of myself, a young woman at Spelman College, eyes full of hope and dreams, a heart unburdened by the weight of others' expectations. This was the Idella no one had ever seen, the woman who loved history, who had once dreamed of a life defined by passion rather than duty. As I worked, I realized something profound. My life had always been about preserving others' stories. I had catalogued, protected, and honored the lives of the Dubois family, of Cornelius, even of Trevant. Now, for the first time, I was authoring my own narrative, deciding which moments mattered, which truths to illuminate, and which shadows to leave behind. This act of creation was freedom itself, a reclamation of a self that had been buried beneath decades of obligation. Evenings became my favorite time, the fading light painting the garden with strokes of amber and crimson. I would sit by the window with a cup of Earl Grey, letting the aroma mingle with the scent of earth and wilting foliage. Through the glass, the world seemed softened, like a watercolor left in rain, and I could breathe in the serenity of a life finally unshackled. I was no longer someone else's wife, mother, or daughter-in-law. I was Idella, fully present, fully alive, shaping the story of my life with each deliberate choice, each quiet reflection, each memory honored. The house was no longer a battlefield, but a sanctuary. Every corner held a story I had chosen to preserve, every photograph a testament to lives touched by love, sacrifice, and resilience. I felt no bitterness, no lingering rage. Only clarity. Life's harshest lessons had taught me that control and power were fleeting, but truth and integrity endured. As I placed the last document into its proper place, I closed the album and allowed myself a long, unburdened breath. I was home. The days stretched on, each one steeped in quiet reflection and subtle joys I had long forgotten. The garden outside my window became a companion, its cycles of growth and decay mirroring the rhythm of my own life. I tended to it slowly, deliberately, feeling the soil crumble between my fingers and marveling at how something so simple could feel so profoundly grounding. Inside, the house breathed with me. Each room was filled with the faint echo of Cornelius' laughter, the warmth of his presence lingering in the corners where sunlight pooled. I began to organize my own collection of documents, photographs, and letters, not as a keeper of others' legacies but as the architect of my own. Each item was a choice, a deliberate act of claiming my history and defining my story. Memories of Trevant occasionally drifted to the surface, sharp and bitter, but I let them pass without grip. Their absence was not mine to mourn. I thought instead of the love I had given and received, the quiet victories of survival, the resilience that had carried me through darkness. My mornings became rituals of reflection, my afternoons filled with cataloging and writing, and my evenings a sacred time for tea by the window, watching the golden light filter through the trees. Each day was a meditation, a practice in recognizing that my life, long defined by duty to others, was now truly mine. Sometimes I imagined the world outside, where Trevant and Kessia lived in their reduced circumstances, stripped of the illusions that had defined them. A part of me felt a quiet justice in their fall, but it was tempered by the knowledge that life itself held its own lessons and reckonings. I focused instead on the world within these walls, the history I preserved, the love I nurtured, and the peace I had finally claimed. Slowly, the basement became not just a sanctuary of documents but a space of creation. I wrote letters, recorded anecdotes, and reflected on moments long past, weaving them into a tapestry that was uniquely mine. It was in these moments that I felt the true weight of freedom, the power to shape memory, to choose meaning, to declare that my life mattered not for what others believed it should be, but for the truths I held and honored. And in this quiet, deliberate crafting of my own story, I discovered a serenity deeper than I had ever known. The world outside might shift and crumble, names might rise and fall, but the integrity of one's own life, the truth one preserves and lives by, remains unassailable. I had finally come home, not to a house defined by history or inheritance, but to a life fully my own. Evenings in the house grew longer and more luminous in their own quiet way. I developed a rhythm, a life measured not by the ambitions of others but by the slow, deliberate cadence of my own heart. I began to write more extensively, crafting the stories of the people I had loved and lost, the triumphs of kindness, the betrayals that had carved their marks into my spirit, and the quiet moments of joy that had sustained me. I discovered a strange joy in watching my own handwriting spread across the pages, each word a reclaiming of time once lost to fear and obedience. One afternoon, I found myself drawn to the attic, a space I had long avoided, thick with dust and the weight of old memories. There, among forgotten trunks and faded photographs, I uncovered remnants of my own past. Letters from friends long gone, journals I had kept as a young woman, and sketches of a life imagined but never lived. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for me to return fully, to reclaim the pieces of my own existence scattered through time and neglect. I spent hours sifting through these relics, reading, remembering, smiling, and sometimes shedding quiet tears for the woman I had been and the life I had lost to circumstance. The house, once a prison of manipulation and deceit, had transformed into a sanctuary of memory, reflection, and creation. Each room held stories not of greed or ambition but of the enduring human spirit, the courage to endure, the capacity to love, and the power to redefine oneself against the odds. And as I moved through the spaces, placing memories in careful order, I realized that the story I had lived, with all its twists, betrayals, and revelations, was now mine to tell fully and without compromise. I was no longer merely a witness to history. I was its author, and in that authorship lay a freedom more profound than any inheritance or title could ever grant. Each day I grew more certain that this reclamation of my life, my narrative, and my dignity was the ultimate triumph. A quiet, unwavering victory over the forces that had once sought to diminish me. The world outside continued in its clamor and chaos, but inside these walls, in this reclaimed home and heart, I had found a peace and power that no one could take away. Winter came slowly, brushing the garden with frost and the first quiet snow. I spent mornings by the windows, watching the subtle transformations of nature, noting how even the cold and barren branches held promise for spring. My days were filled with writing, cataloging, and organizing the treasures of memory I had unearthed. Yet evenings brought a deeper reflection. I often thought of Trevant and Kessia, not with hatred, not with bitterness, but with a clear understanding of their fragility. They had built their lives on illusions, on the fragility of a name rather than the substance of character. And when those illusions collapsed, they had nowhere left to stand. In contrast, I had rebuilt from ruins. My son's absence was a hollow ache, a reminder of sacrifices unrecognized and love unreturned, but it was also a testament to resilience. Cornelius's memory lingered in quiet ways in the warm hum of the kitchen, in the subtle aroma of his favorite tea, in the echo of his laughter from years past. I realized that our lives, our legacies, are not built solely from possessions or societal recognition, but from the truths we honor, the care we extend to others, and the integrity we uphold when no one is watching. In this reflection, I found the courage to embrace solitude, to value my own story, and to see the beauty in the life I had carved for myself, independent of approval or legacy from others. Each night, as I closed my eyes, I felt a profound calm, knowing that the history I had preserved, the letters, the photographs, the accounts of lives intertwined with mine, was now a testament not to suffering but to enduring strength. And in that quiet strength, I discovered the purest form of freedom, to live fully, to honor truth, and to write the story of one's own soul without fear, without compromise, and without regret. Spring arrived gently, carrying with it a sense of renewal I had not felt in decades. The garden bloomed, each petal and leaf a small celebration of survival and quiet triumph. I spent hours walking among the pecan trees, feeling the earth beneath my feet, listening to the whisper of the wind, and letting memories of Cornelius and Langston Du Bois mingle with the present. In my basement sanctuary, now a luminous archive, I continued to catalog, write, and reflect, but my work had shifted. It was no longer solely about preserving the past for others. It was about creating a narrative for myself, honoring every choice, every sacrifice, every moment that had shaped my journey. Occasionally, I would think of Trevant and Kessia, wondering how they adjusted to their diminished world. There was no desire for revenge anymore, no thrill in their downfall, only a sober understanding that their fate was a reflection of the values they had chosen. And in that understanding, I felt a deeper peace. I realized that true power lies not in social dominance or inherited names, but in self-possession, clarity of purpose, and unwavering integrity. Each document I touched, every photograph I revisited, every letter I reread was a reminder of lives lived fully and honestly, lives that had faced hardship yet preserved dignity. And as I sat by the window, watching the garden awaken to life once more, I finally recognized the extraordinary strength in ordinary things: the warmth of a hand held, the laughter of a loved one remembered, the quiet act of preserving truth for its own sake. In that spring light, I felt a profound gratitude for the story I had lived, the story I was still writing, and the freedom I had earned not by fighting others, but by reclaiming myself. The days flowed into weeks, each one a gentle rhythm of routine and discovery. I took to walking through the city early in the mornings, long before the streets filled with noise and haste, finding solace in the quiet corners that reminded me of my youth. Bookshops became my havens, and I would spend hours poring over texts that had once seemed inaccessible, reconnecting with the curiosity and passion that had defined Idella before life demanded compromise. At home, the basement archive grew richer, shelves lined not only with documents of the Du Bois family but with my own collected stories, letters I had written but never sent, and reflections on what it truly meant to live authentically. The garden outside mirrored this quiet restoration, the pecan trees standing as steadfast witnesses to the passage of time, the flowers blooming as if in celebration of life reclaimed. I often found myself smiling at small things, The pattern of sunlight on a leaf, the scent of Earl Grey mingling with fresh soil, the simple joy of putting thoughts to paper without expectation or judgment. Occasionally, memories of Cornelius surfaced, bittersweet yet comforting, a reminder that love and devotion had always been at the heart of the life I had led. Trevant and Kessia were distant echoes now, their world having moved far from mine, their ambition and greed leaving them fragile and unmoored. I held no malice. Their lesson had been taught, and justice of a kind had been quietly served. I had discovered that freedom was not simply the absence of conflict, but the presence of self-possession, of knowing one's own story and claiming it fully. In the stillness of my house, surrounded by memory and truth, I finally understood that my life was mine alone to shape, and in that shaping lay a peace so profound it made every past wound fade into insignificance. The house had grown quieter with each passing day. The echoes of past confrontations seemed to fade into the corners of the rooms, leaving only a solemn calm. Idella moved through the halls with a sense of ownership that no one could challenge. Every photograph, every memento, every letter she had collected whispered the stories of lives that had shaped her own. Trevant and Kessia were gone from the city, swallowed by the obscurity of small-town anonymity. Their ambitions collapsed under the weight of their deceit. Idella, however, was free. Free not just from them, but from the burden of their expectations, the constant performance required to maintain the appearance of the Dubois legacy. She descended into the basement, now a sanctuary of her own making. The light that spilled in through the new window illuminated her workspace where every document, every memory, was catalogued meticulously. Here she was no longer defined by the roles imposed on her: wife, mother, daughter-in-law. Here she was a historian, a keeper of truth, an author of her own life. Sitting at the large work table, she placed her hands on the old leather-bound album she had begun. Langston Dubois's letter, a testament to love and nobility, lay on the first page. Beside it, a photograph of her younger self, full of hope and curiosity, a girl in glasses at Spelman College, unaware of the trials and betrayals life would later bring. She smiled softly, tracing the contours of the face in the photo, remembering the dreams she had once held, and the strength it had taken to survive the loss, the humiliation, and the deception of those she had called family. Outside, the garden thrummed with the rhythm of the season, leaves tumbling and resting on the earth, promising renewal. Idella poured herself a cup of Earl Grey tea, its warmth grounding her in the present, its aroma a comfort she had learned to cherish. She sipped slowly, savoring the clarity that came with finally reclaiming her narrative. Freedom was no longer a concept but a lived reality, and in that freedom she found not vengeance, not triumph, but a deep and abiding peace. The house no longer whispered of past threats or shadows of fear. It resonated with life, with history preserved and honored, with a story finally told on her terms. The basement, once a place of imprisonment and despair, had become her sanctum, a library of memories where she could chart the course of her own existence. Idella allowed herself a long, quiet breath, feeling the weight of decades lift from her shoulders. Here, surrounded by the past yet firmly in control of her own present, she knew that the life she had built through resilience, intelligence, and careful patience was her own, untouchable by deceit or ambition. And for the first time in years she felt truly, completely, irrevocably free. The days turned into weeks, and the house settled into a rhythm of quiet grace. Idella spent her mornings in the garden, tending to the pecan tree under which little Trevant had once played, now a symbol not of loss, but of life continuing on its own terms. The afternoons were devoted to her archives, sorting letters, photographs, and documents, weaving them into a coherent narrative of truth and memory. Each piece was a testament to resilience, a reminder that history, personal or familial, was not just to be inherited but actively preserved and understood. She often paused to sip her tea, watching sunlight dance across the walls, feeling the pulse of the life she had chosen to lead. Occasionally, distant relatives would visit, cautious at first, but they soon learned to respect her authority and wisdom, realizing that the old woman who had once been underestimated was now the undisputed keeper of the Dubois legacy. Cornelius's presence lingered in quiet moments, a gentle echo of love and partnership that guided her decisions. The injustices of the past, the betrayals, the forged documents, the shattered illusions of Trevant and Kessia, no longer held sway over her heart. She had dismantled their pretensions not out of cruelty, but to restore integrity, to protect the essence of the family she truly loved. At night, she would light a single candle in the study, a beacon of calm and reflection, and write in her journal. Here she documented not just facts and dates, but feelings, small triumphs, and lessons learned. The girl with glasses from Spelman College had grown into a woman who understood that freedom was earned not by defiance alone, but by steadfast dedication to truth and to self. And so, as the house hummed softly with the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the city beyond, Idella finally felt complete. Not vengeful, not bitter, but whole. She had navigated the storms of deceit and ambition, emerged unbroken, and claimed her place in the story not as a footnote, but as its author. The past had been honored, the present embraced, and the future, whatever it held, was hers to define. Idella sipped her tea one last time for the evening, smiling faintly to herself, feeling the profound satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a narrative written by her own hand, a legacy preserved not through fear or power, but through patience, courage, and the unwavering truth of her heart. She was free, and in that freedom she was finally eternally home.